we're learning from one country to another from their experience.
We don't believe that God is actively causing this.
I think it's very important for us to welcome to everyone who's watching us on Facebook, and also all our friends near and far here in the Philippines, in the US, and in the UK. Now we have Dr. Andrew Kirk from the UK, who's a theologian. Andrew has spent some time in Latin America, and it would be good to hear him as well from the UK end, as well as his own reflections on how this pandemic has been affecting some of our friends in Latin America. And Gracie also is from Costa Rica, and so it would be good to hear also what she has to think in relation to how this pandemic has been affecting our friends in Latin America. And Bill will be sort of thinking through some of the theological issues that need to be raised and surfaced as we are experiencing this pandemic. So first we will try and hear from Andrew in the UK, his observations as well as his own reflections on what is happening there. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Melba, and lovely to see Bill and Grace as well. And I hope this will be a great opportunity for us to interact. Now, I'm going to start. I've been asked to talk a little bit about the pandemic from a personal Christian perspective. I'm going to start with plagues in general. There's a long history of plagues in different parts of the world. If you look in Wikipedia, which I did the other day, it gives a list of approximately 250 epidemics. Most of them are localized, but some of them, like the bubonic plagues, are pandemics, like COVID-19. This latter has repeated itself in different parts of the world, and the first recorded pandemic, I think, was in the time of the Emperor Justinian in around about 540 AD. Now, from that, one could speak an awful lot about that, but I'll go then straight away to plagues in the Bible, where the plagues are mentioned. Obviously, the most talked about are the epidemics affecting the Egyptians at the time of the Exodus. But probably if one is comparing that with COVID-19, the only one of the 10 plagues that are mentioned there that would compare with what we are experiencing today in some kind of a way, because it affects our physical natures, would be the festering boils. And they cause much suffering to human skin. Now, Psalm 91 and verse 6 makes reference to the pestilence that stalks in darkness and the plague that destroys at midday. And the comment here is that God will deliver us from both the pestilence and the plague. I'm doing my Bible reading at the moment in 1 Chronicles, and it just so happens that today, the very day that we are talking together, in 1 Chronicles chapter 21, God sends a plague on Israel. And he sends a plague on Israel as a punishment because David orders a census on all the Israel's fighting men. And God gives him a choice of 3 options, and he chooses the plague. Then we can skip, there's obviously more to be talked about from the Old Testament, but we can skip right to the last book of the Bible, and we see in Revelation chapter 15 that it mentions the 7 last plagues that bring an end to God's judgment on a rebellious world. At the end of Revelation, almost the last verse of Revelation, Jesus adds, if anyone adds anything to them, that is to say, the words of the prophecy of this book, God will add to him the plagues described in the book. Now, I couldn't find that plagues were often mentioned in the Bible, but they certainly are there in certain circumstances. Now, a plague refers more or less to any kind of calamity or any kind of affliction, but probably the word pestilence most clearly describes the plague that we are talking about today, COVID-19. The dictionary definition is, a plague is any contagious disease that is epidemic and deadly, noxious to health or life, and troublesome. There are probably other definitions as well. Now jumping to our present time. COVID-19 was first announced to the world towards the end of last year, less than 6 months ago, although it seems almost like a lifetime. There is some evidence that it may have arisen as early as last September, and the origin seems to be from China. Although there have been other pandemics during this century, notably SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, and that occurred in the years 2002 to 2004, and avian influenza, which has the number H5N1, which has reoccurred several times since then. But in spite of the fact that we have had epidemics and some pandemics, the world has by and large seemed to be unprepared for what we are now experiencing. And this time the pandemic has been on a scale not experienced during the lifetime, I would suggest during the lifetime of anyone who is alive today. I certainly cannot remember anything equivalent to what we are going through. COVID-19 also appears to be a completely new virus strain, and scientific experts are still puzzling over it. For this reason, it is very difficult to say anything very definite about it until such time as the scientists themselves have been able to catch up with what is happening. Now I switch to COVID-19, particularly in my country, in the United Kingdom. But I think probably what I have to say could be said in most countries over the world, in the Philippines, in the US, in Latin America, and so on. So probably what I have to say will resonate with most people listening. Scientists have not always been agreed in my country about the best action to pursue. You have scientists popping up every so often, interviewed on television, radio, and so on. And you find one opinion here and another opinion there. And one of the problems is that the virus seems to have had different effects in different countries, so that cross-national learning, that is to say, learning from one country to another from their experience, has not always been possible. Then again, scientists and politicians are not always agreed about the best policies to put in place, at least not in my country. Scientists have usually been quite a bit more cautious about easing restrictions that have been put in place at the beginning of the epidemic. In other words, scientists are more what we call risk averse. Politicians, on the other hand, have focused more on the enormous economic damage that has been caused by prolonging the restrictions, the lockdowns, the impossibility of meeting in closed spaces, and so on. Another factor in this that we have experienced is that the high percentage of deaths have been firstly amongst the elderly, and secondly amongst those of people of color who have contracted the disease. And the reasons for this are still to be analyzed and worked out. Another factor of this, of course, and is a factor which um, is universal, is the economic damage which has been caused, which is very severe. In our case, the loss of jobs is huge. Businesses are folding because they are not taking in any income. People are not allowed out. People are not allowed to, for example, well, that's changing now, but they haven't been allowed to shop for a long time, except online. And not everybody runs their business exactly online. A third factor is economic factor is that our nation, probably like most nations, I think most of the European nations, are accruing enormous debt by borrowing in order to support jobs, hopefully, so that there will come a time when we are much easier in our restrictions, when jobs will again be possible. And also for the enormous additional support for the health service. So economic damage hits people of color and young people the hardest. And we are in a situation now when a number of school leavers are leaving and hoping to join the job market and will find it extremely difficult to find a job. Another factor is what has been called the increase in mental stress due to the fact that we have all had to be isolated in our own home. Therefore, we have not had regular contact except in this mode through Zoom or through Skype with our family, with our friends, with our colleagues. And that also, I think, is one of the most devastating effects of the pandemic, that we haven't been able to meet with people face to face. Children, because schools have been closed, have been confined, and sometimes they are confined in very small spaces. This has been going on now for 3 months in our case, since lockdown was first introduced towards the end of March. And one can imagine the effects that has had on young children no longer able to meet with their friends, no longer able to learn in a proper environment, although they have been able to learn to a certain extent in homeschooling. But nevertheless, it has been very, very difficult for them. There is also the uncertainty about the future. When will the pandemic end? Nobody really has much idea. I suppose it will end when some kind of inoculation has been discovered. And a lot of people in different parts of the world are certainly working at that, not least in the UK, not very far from where I live in Oxford. They are working night and day on finding a vaccine that will help us to overcome this pandemic. People are asking, will there be a new normal? When we come to an end of this, will we simply return to what we were doing before? Or will everything be different? It's an uncertainty there. And what about the possibility of, as I have already mentioned, about paid work? How are people going to find the work that will keep them in a living situation? Finally, one or two reflections. As I've mentioned already, we are facing uncertainties. We don't have a strong hold on what the future may provide. We are also facing, to a certain extent, what might be called impotence in the face of a major worldwide threat. And particularly in the Western world, we don't like to be thought impotent. We believe that we have the answer in science to most, if not all, our problems. So far, that has not been, strictly speaking, true in this case. We are facing the death of relations and friends. I know one or two people, certainly, who have died as a result of contracting this pandemic. Also, we are facing the possibility of our own death, and particularly if you're somebody of my age, that is more likely. We are facing our own vulnerability. My final reflection, and this takes us more into what can Christians say in all this. We are perhaps, there is indications of this, I think, in the media and elsewhere, that humans are becoming more conscious of the fact that we do not live by bread alone. And some, as a result of this, may have turned to the living word of God. However, I do suspect that in the profoundly secular West, it will not necessarily amount to a flood of new believers, but there is certainly indication that particularly when our worship services and so on are now free for anybody to view, if they have the right equipment, people are tuning in who one would never see in a church context. I hope I may be wrong about the flood of new believers, but that is part of our uncertainty about the future. Okay, I think that's all I have to say.
Well, thank you, Andrew. Andrew was saying maybe we can think through the fact that there is a new sense of spirituality, maybe not in the way the churches understand it, but certainly a new sense of transcendence for Westerners who are suddenly out of control.
Yeah.
All the power, all the control is gone, before this pandemic. That's very interesting. Where I see it, people always feel that they have no control. I mean, we are being controlled by the government and everything else. But it's very interesting that in the West, it hits you very badly. The loss of power and control before something that nobody is able to contain. Grace, you'd like to say something?
Well, I really appreciate the biblical reflection of remembering pandemics and pestilence, coming way back from the scripture, because it feels like that we're hit with one thing after another. And people are just saying, okay, now where are the locusts? The plague of locusts, which actually in Africa, they're experiencing.
East Africa, yes.
Exactly. They're experiencing that plague of locusts. And so we're feeling the sense of time is irrelevant. We're back in early times. We're part of this whole movement of humanity. And what you have brought to us is remembering that God has accompanied us throughout history, throughout humanity, even in times of those early pestilence. And God is accompanying us now in our own pestilence. And I think that some of the reflections that I have had about the current pandemic with COVID-19 is that in countries where there is strong leadership and leadership that really is empathetic and compassionate with people, you have the fewer cases. I by sideline, I will mention most of those countries are led by women, which is a very interesting
Of
thing to.
course, of course.
But in my country, Costa Rica, for example, which is not led by a woman, and the leadership has been, you know, somewhat faulty. But the thing that they do have is a structure in society from the very beginning, from the 1940s, where Costa Rica eliminated armies and said, we will not have any military. Instead, we will invest in education and health and well-being of our citizens. As a result of that, they've had very few cases. You know, yes, they've been strict, they've closed down, they've done all the things that they have done, but also their medical system is decentralized. So rather than taking a patient to the hospital when they get sick with COVID, the doctors and nurses are going to that patient's house from the little clinic that is in their neighborhood because they already know the history of that patient. They already know what's going on with that patient, and they've been able then to work with that patient as a person that has a history and not just as a COVID number. So it's been very interesting to see these reflections. And I was recently on a webinar looking at how the church is involved in informal settlements around the globe. We had someone from Sri Lanka, someone from Kenya, someone from the Philippines, and someone from Mexico on the webinar. And, you know, they're lessons that we have learned from past pandemics or pestilence that many governments are not learning, are not taking forth. But when we talked about how, where in these countries has the church had a successful impact and is doing something, including what ISACC did, we found that one of the things that is very important is that we know our communities. We have to be a part of our communities. We can't be isolated in our little churches doing our little programs and oblivious to what's going on around us. We need to, because at a time of pandemic, we need to know each other. We need to know, and that's why Costa Rica's been successful. So that was one lesson we got from there. We need to know our community and increase the databases that we have in order to be able to work with our community at a time of crisis. Another thing was some of the successful ones, they have networks already in place of churches, of interfaith work that they're doing, of government and interfaith and NGOs, evangelicals. The Evangelical Alliance in Sri Lanka is doing amazing things with an interfaith network. That was already in place. And so when this pandemic struck, the Department of Public Health calls the Alliance and says, can you help us? Because they know they're reaching the people, the grassroots. And so it's a fantastic opportunity for the church to be able to serve the community in a broader sense. And then the other thing was the importance of right now the spiritual aspect that the church can bring. I know here in our context, people are longing for that. Where is the hope? And how do we move forward? And so I think that this is why we have this conversation with Andrew and Bill to say, where is the hope? Help us think about that. Bill, maybe you have some reflections that you want to add to this. Move forward.
Yeah, everybody wants to know, ultimately, people of faith, where is God and how is God involved? And that's something that I've been thinking about a lot. What strikes me is that not only in this situation, but really throughout history, one can also see that there has been times when evil has been predominant and other times that it has been overcome in certain ways. And in fact, one can say that one always sees in every situation signs of what I call a trajectory of death and on the other hand, a trajectory of life. And I think even reflecting on, if I'm not mistaken, Andrew's writings on Latin America, when he's spoken about liberation theology and the signs of God's presence and signs of hope in those situations. Whereas if you could look on other aspects of Latin America during that time, you would have seen much to discourage you, much to feel like God is not present in that. So I think that's a way we need to think about this today. On the one hand, there's the trajectory of death. I think we don't believe that God is actively causing this. God's relationship to evil is mysterious in some ways, but we believe that God has given the creation a certain autonomy, and therefore it has the tendencies to the trajectory of death. We know that there are certain things that went wrong when this virus leapt from the animal kingdom into the human sphere. That there was something that went wrong, and that probably ultimately humans were responsible for that, not God. So the trajectory of death, we have to say, is not something that God is causing. But what God is at work in during this time, as God is always at work, is building and working on the new kingdom, the kingdom of God, the new creation, renewal, hope. And one looks and sees signs of this in the scientific establishment. We're grateful for all the cooperative work that's being done. We look and see the courageous efforts of frontline workers who are giving their lives and really even willing to put themselves at risk for the sake of their patients. And we see communities that, like those that Grace just mentioned, that are coming together in ways that perhaps are new, and we can hope will continue after the pandemic has gone. But these are signs, and what we know is that God is still at work, and God is present in these signs of hope. And this is where we need to send our resources. This is where we put our shoulders to the wheel. This is where we hope we can be making a difference, because we can identify this is where hope is to be found. And we're grateful for that. And we thank God for that, because we believe in certain ways that God is present in those efforts, and we want to support them.
Andrew,
I,
Melba, go. Melba, go.
I just want to ask a question to both Andrew and Bill. On the one hand, there is this rediscovery of the spiritual sense of transcendence, because we are face to face with death and things we cannot control. On the other hand, especially among church people, there is this sense that, this is the end times. We better just evangelize. We, we are seeing all the signs of uh, of the end times, so it sort of paralyzes many people in that way. On the one hand, um, it's a good opportunity, these mental health issues of those who are suddenly powerless, for the church to respond to. On the other hand, here in the Philippines, there is the sense that, well, these are the end times, and so we just evangelize and put all our energies into this. What do you have to say to this? This whole
Well,
theological sort of
first thing I would say is that the end times started with the resurrection of Jesus Christ,
Right.
in a sense.
yeah.
So we've always been in the end times,
Yeah.
but we can't place a date on it. Even Jesus couldn't tell us when he was on earth exactly what the date would be. It was only known to the Father. So this keeps us as a way in anticipation of something that will definitely happen at some stage. And I believe that the New Testament in particular is very, very much focused towards the not necessarily the physical second coming of Jesus Christ, but certainly towards the coming of the kingdom and the fullness of the coming of the kingdom. And this is often in the New Testament put in contrast to the way in which this world behaves. So particularly in the Johannine writings, you get this great contrast between the world which is in rebellion against God and the world which is part of God's kingdom. And Jesus' famous words, "My kingdom is not of this world," is always a sign of hope that there is something better to come, but that something which is better to come is already visible in ways that we've already begun to outline in the church's compassion and people's compassion and sacrifice and dedication to other people's needs. I think it's been absolutely amazing to see what people have gone through in order to save lives. On the other hand, there's an awful lot in our fallen world where lives are not being saved, but on the contrary are being dispensed or overcome or thrown out. So we live in this tension, as it were, between the two worlds. And it seems to me there is so much evidence, of which the pandemic is one piece of evidence, but so much other evidence as well around, that this is exactly what one would expect to see happening in our world. But the hope is always there that there will be a new creation, new heavens and a new earth, where righteousness reigns completely and utterly. There will be an end to suffering. This is not the final word. This is not God's last word to his creation, but his last word is the new creation. And this is the very real reality which people who seek to believe and follow Jesus are already experiencing in their lives. Hopefully, we are in a situation where we can convey something of this, we can pass something of this on to other people who really are in despair over the situation for very good reason, some of which I have outlined earlier. Loss of jobs, loss of family, loss of people we love and have known well, and so on, which has been, a terrible experience for many people. The situation where people have died and the family has not been able to be there at the time of the funeral, for example.
Mm-hmm.
These sort of situations, which, as Melba has said, is something we haven't, we're not able to control because we're living under this threat.
Yeah, I just want to interrupt here a minute and say hi to all of those who are watching and participating with us, and hi to friends who have sent me messages. We're glad to see you all. This is a very important conversation. And Bill, do you want to add something to what Andrew said here?
Well, I just wanted to second Andrew's idea that actually the end times does begin with the resurrection of Jesus, because that is the sign of the new kingdom that God is bringing about. And people say, well, that was 2,000 years ago. That's a long time. Well, 2,000 years in God's program is really not a very long time at all. In fact, I look out my window and I'm looking at mountains that scientists tell me were formed probably between 1 and 2 million years ago. So actually 2,000 years is a little blip on that screen. So in a sense, we are at the end time. But I want to remind everyone what Martin Luther said when somebody when he said that if somebody told me that Christ was returning tomorrow, today I would go out and plant a tree. So I think that's what we're busy doing. We need to go out and plant our trees. That's what we're called to do. The scientists are doing that day and night. As Andrew said, they're working on the vaccine. They're planting their tree. We've got to decide what is the tree that God wants us to plant, and then get busy doing it. That's our job, even if we are at the end of history.
Melba, can you reflect also on this?
Well, first of all, this new earth, we have a little bit of that experience. I mean, for the first time, we can breathe in Metro Manila. There's no traffic. There is no pollution. And of course, they say the ozone layer has gotten a little bit better. It seems to me that, I mean, from our two theologians, it seems to me that we do have some signs of where we can be going. One is this: what does it mean for us to live our life systems as Christians in such a way that that we are experiencing even bits of this new earth, like here, for instance, we have been inspired, many of our neighbors, to start planting their own food in their own backyards. And some of my friends have that technology to do this stuff. And I feel that maybe it has to be, part of this making of the new earth, that we, even in urban centers, that we deglobalize a little bit. At least our food should be coming not from afar, but here, because we have experienced that when you are locked down, I mean, you may have lots of money, but the food comes from Baguio all the way. So when you're locked down, that's it, no? They cannot sell the food, and we cannot buy the food. So it's becoming important for us to have food security, to see to it that within our vicinity, what is the proximate space we have, our food is secure. So that's one lesson, at least for me. I don't have a green thumb, so I don't know how to do this myself. But but I think it's a very good reminder for us of, and maybe the church itself. Instead of having all these big buildings, that we have these idle lands planted, so that we have more food security where we are. So that's one thing. Um, I was thinking about the continuity of our experience, even in small ways, of this new heaven and new earth that we are experiencing in church, in community. And earlier, we had a conversation with our friends on uh, what it means for churches to maintain and deepen our social and communal life, even if we are physically distant. Of course, technology plays a great deal, but one of the good things I have seen is that we are forced to get away from being mega churches and all this preoccupation with huge buildings. We have some very large mega churches here, which cost billions to build, and we are getting away from that and going back to being small communities or believers as families, the resurrection of the family altar, and so on. So it seems to me, what is the Lord saying to us now? Um, are these signs of what the future should be for us, the true normal, no? For us as churches, um, instead of just going back to what we are used to. In other words, developing new wineskins according to our own context. I'm very uh, curious about the mental health issues, particularly of young people in the West. I think, Andrew, you said something about this, that it's the young people and the people of color who actually have been uh, very much affected by this. I was wondering if uh, the the churches can help in this, for instance, in the medical frontliners, where you have lots of Filipinos. Uh, we have, I think, an association of Filipino medical workers in the UK,
Yeah.
and they have actually complained that they are always put on the front line. Maybe because, well, Filipinos are long suffering. We do not complain. We just do what we need to do. And
Maybe because you're more compassionate.
well, that's possible also. But one of them said we cannot complain because we're migrants. We're foreigners in this land. So even if for them, they're actually very, very tired and really exhausted, but they still, are asked to do these things. So in fact, one male nurse died on his own, without any intervention. And I was wondering whether there is enough attention put on all of these migrants or the, the non-British sort of frontliners, the people of color, um, because they are migrants and so on. What is the church able to do in UK for these people?
What it has done, of course, is to raise the issue. There's always good that comes out of even something which is we're all suffering from. And one of the things is that it widens our perspectives, and we see things that we haven't seen before, such as the things that Melba has just been mentioning. The heavy way in which we are supported by people from overseas, for example, and the way in which they have undertaken to be part of or to follow their responsibilities as medical personnel, and it goes right through our medical system. That an awful lot of people who are or have been in recent generations immigrants into our nation are actually active in our medical professions, from, let's say, the least experienced to the most experienced. And it's very interesting, when you're looking at doctor so-and-so or nurse so-and-so or something, to look at the names with which they come, because, they could be located in vastly different parts of the world with regard to their origins. Now, this is something I think which has come to the fore as a result of this pandemic. And a lot of people are talking about the way in which, particularly, people at the lower end of the medical profession and people who are simply support staff in our hospitals and so on, have been not properly looked after, have not been properly supported. Their wages have been very often very low. And I think that this is something which hopefully will not be part of the future. It won't be it won't be the same normal as before. These are things which our pandemic has raised for the public to think about and to act upon.
Yeah, I think that you're exactly right, Andrew. it's like this pandemic has opened up a veil, cleared away the veil for us to see how things have not been working well
Yeah.
in our current economy, our current social structure, you know, in the health system, the way in which, you know, it's a lot of our economy has grown off the backs of people who are migrants, who are poor, who are working at slave wages, and yet we call our economies prospering. But no, it's at the expense of people. And I think this pandemic has pulled that veil apart, and, and we're all questioning, we don't want this kind of structure going forward. So what does the new normal look like? You know, what kind of a structure do we want? And there are actual people in secular fields talking about Jubilee economics. They're using that biblical term. And I think this is why it's an opportunity for the church to say, we can't be isolated anymore. Let's be at the table of saying these economic structures are unjust and not moral. And that's what we're seeing in the US with the Black Lives Matter, where, you know, this has really been another thing that has thrown open the unjust ways that the structures of our society have been working. And it has repercussions all across the globe, with racism being an issue that humanity deals with. But who can help us with racism if it isn't the church, right? Who can really help us deal with these things? And yeah, go, Melba.
There's a question that's related to what you said, Grace. Creation can be possible only from the churches. Roy Soto, one of the biggest obstacles we have, in fact, he says, is that the disconnect, of the churches and its theology from creation and the larger society. Maybe Bill and Andrew want to.
Yeah, since we know Roy so well, we can answer.
Right.
That.
Hello.
Yeah.
Roy
So,
actually has
I've been thinking actually of the Magnificat of Mary, where the low are lifted up and the high are brought down. When we've talked recently about who the essential workers are, it turns out the essential workers are the people who are picking our food, who are stocking our grocery shelves, and even the ones that are, in our case, since we don't go out, delivering it to our door. These are the essential workers. In a sense, these are the ones who nobody's paid any attention to, and they don't have even a living wage. And now the whole situation in the world has reversed that and turned it upside down. So in a certain sense, what signs of this, what Melba is talking about, of the new earth, are maybe showing up all around us, and we need to look for them and encourage them and say, yes, that's right, these are essential workers. Let's make them, their salaries equivalent to what their importance are in our lives.
Andrew. You have
Yeah.
it? No.
No, nothing. I mean, I agree with Bill absolutely on this. It's another thing. I mean, it's not just the medical profession we're talking about. It's about all kinds of people involved in the daily struggle of living and helping us in ways that we haven't appreciated in the past, maybe. But now we are beginning to see of the tremendous value that these people have to ordinary everyday living.
Right.
And that is a wonderful sign, and something that we need to, to continue to reflect and think about and act on in the future.
Yeah, Eric Miller has a comment. He says, we see the same thing in America. The majority of experts being consulted on at least the networks I watch are people of color from many lands. So here we see that, you know, we cannot be separated out. I'm not exactly sure how he was referencing that, but I remember being in Singapore a couple of years ago and at a church gathering and asking the people, do you have poor here? Pastors and leaders. Are there a lot of poor here in Singapore? And they said to me, no, we really don't have any poor. And yet when I was talking to the servers at my tables and different places around the city, and I would ask them, where do they live? They commute all the way back to the border with Malaysia. You know, they live in very squalid situations. And the pandemic has now thrown that open for Singapore, and the world has seen that, right? And so I think this is a wake-up call.
Yeah.
We cannot be our silos operating in a way that is completely oblivious to the structures around us. And that's really a challenge for us as individuals. We need to start looking at who is serving us, caring about them, responding, and then as a church to our community, and then also as a country to our nation. You know, it's time for Christians to continue being the light and salt and yeast that we do see happen, but to break open in new ways. And it comes from our deep conviction that this is our calling. Bill, you were going to say something.
Well, I think that to respond directly to Roy's question, the church is being challenged right now to decide and see where it's going to put its efforts and see what God is doing, and to put their efforts in those signs of new life, those signs of the kingdom that are going on. And these are, part of them are the kind of Magnificat symbolism that I referred to. This is something that the church is concerned about, because the church is especially committed to the marginal, because that's where Jesus was interested. So we want to put our efforts in that, find out how we can promote that kind of promotion of bringing the low up and bringing the high down.
I think sometimes we forget that the church is universal, and the vast majority of members of the church are from a poor community or poor communities.
That's right. Yeah.
You know, if you're thinking about Latin America, you're thinking about Africa and parts of Asia as well. And in Europe in particular, there's a sense in which white Christianity, if that's the right term to use, that is to say, members of white churches are in decline. And what is keeping the Christian church alive and in good order and so on are precisely the immigrant churches, which you find now all over Europe. So when you're talking about racism, for example, you're talking about our brothers and sisters in Christ, not just, you know, in a kind of theoretical way. And I think that's a very important consideration. Well, I was listening to an interview with the Mayor of London recently, who was being interviewed by a black pastor. Well, no, it wasn't a pastor. He was a communicator and a singer. And one of the things he said, and he's from a South Asian background, and he was saying what a fantastic job the colored churches or black churches in London have been in this pandemic. And that was a great encouragement, I think, and a great witness from somebody who clearly is not a Christian himself, but recognized what the Christians were about and doing, under the radar, as we say. That is to say, not easily visible, but just doing what the kingdom demands that we should always do, what following Jesus demands we should be about.
We have only about 10 minutes left. I have a question from Marie Pring. She says, how do we help train the church to be sensitive and to spot the signposts of the kingdom in this historic moment of Christianity? Melba, do you want to start with that?
Well, I think so much has to happen in our consciousness that we are actually experiencing two things. We are experiencing the new earth that God is doing in the world. We are also experiencing the fallenness of it.
Right.
And unfortunately, as Jason here has observed, our gospel tends to think about not the new creation, but its destruction. So that we talk about the end times and all the rest of it. And I appreciate that comment from Jason. Um, I, I I think we need to first of all repair the lopsided theology that we're getting in our churches. You know, this is Marie is a pastor, and then maybe the pastors need to be re-educated all over again. That we do live in the new creation now, and there are signs of it, even as we see signs of catastrophe at the same time. And we need to hold these two things together. And
That's right.
unless we have that kind of theology, um, we will always be blind to the signposts of the kingdom, which is in our midst, and which also is present in many communities that are not exactly churches. I mean, in ISACC, we have many friends. We call them overhearers who actually, I think, are signs of the kingdom. They're doing things that are signs of the kingdom, but
Right.
they're not exactly believers. Although, because of the work that we do, they get very attracted to the kinds of, and then they start asking, "What kind of Christians are you?" You know, in other words, when we have a public voice, uh, we we always have this challenge, you know, to give an account of the hope that is in us. Um, I think I think people sharply divide the, you know, what is evangelism, what is social justice. When the truth is that, you know, as the Micah Declaration says, I mean, social justice has evangelistic consequences, and we have experienced that in ISACC. People always we always have a platform. People always ask us, "What kind of gospel do you have? You're very different from the kinds of Christians we know." So you have always an opening. We don't have to stand on a soapbox and blare out, you know, like a trumpet, all these things. But we always get asked, you know, what is the hope that is in you? And so it has evangelistic consequences. And at the same time, we also have, I mean, doing evangelism necessarily also means, you know, this bigger witness that God does love people. And in this pandemic, once again, we have experienced that in in our relief. I mean, people, when we ask our urban poor communities, would you like us to pray for you? Because we don't like to proselytize. We just want to be respectful and ask, you know, and 100% want to be prayed for. And many of them actually are very moved and almost cry, you know, in tears. So, you know, acts of compassion also has evangelistic consequences. So it's I think that's where we need to begin the wholeness of the gospel, so that people are more sensitive when they see signs of this kingdom around them.
I want to read a comment from our friend Ray Grisaldo, whom most of us know. But he says maybe equipping churches to have an eye for appreciative inquiry might be a good start. In other words, noticing the little new good things that are sprouting and making ways to scale it up and sustain it. I think he makes a really valid point that we cannot, by focusing on the negative, we don't build, we actually end up destroying. But by focusing on the positive of little things that are happening, we build up and empower. And that's what Jesus did. If you look at what he talked to the woman at the well, you know, you can give me a cup of water, realizing that dependency that he had on her. And this is what the church needs to learn to do. So thank you, Ray, for bringing this up. It's clearly one of my favorite methodologies, so I had to push his comment in here. But in closing, Andrew and Bill, maybe you have some final words of wisdom, or at least some final words from your heart that you can share with our audience and with us. Andrew?
Yeah, well, I was just going to respond to the question about training. I think it's very easy to speak as we've been speaking today, and you know, to have hopefully good answers or reasonably good answers to the questions that are being asked. On the other hand, the really important thing is that we live out the gospel, that we live it out in practice, both at community level, the level of our community, our Christian communities, the level of individuals. And this is exactly what Jesus did. He didn't shy away from teaching. There was plenty of teaching in his ministry, but also by the actions, by the way he behaved, by the way he dealt with people, and the way he illustrated his teaching through action seems to me to be what most appeals to people who, you know, perhaps have little or no connection with the Christian faith or with the gospel. They notice people's lives, and the question, therefore, the fundamental question is, how should we then live? Whether it's during a pandemic or whether the pandemic is past and we get back to a slightly more kind of normal life as we used to live it, how should we live? And it's a daily question. It's a question that we keep having to ask ourselves about and keep praying about, that the Lord will show us each day as it comes, how should we live in the light of all that Jesus represents. I think that would be my final word, not just to the people who've been watching and listening,
Amen.
but very much to myself.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you. I agree. No, I think we should just be followers of Jeremiah's encouragement. Seek the peace of the city. Seek the shalom of the place where you are, because in its peace, you will have your own shalom. You will find your own peace.
Melba, you have the final word and close us off, please.
Well, I would like to thank our viewers now and for their comments. Maybe it's good to close with this remark from Eric Miller, our friend, when he says that the churches also need to hear the gospel, not just those who are yet to become believers. And I think this is a very apt thing for all of us now. When Andrew was talking about how should we then live and build on this whole idea of the new creation, I think it's very important for us to once again ask, are we hearing the gospel truly as his church? And what new wineskins are we being invited to enter into?
Right.
what are the old wineskins that are actually not just obsolete but wrong. And as Gracie has said, this pandemic has opened a Pandora's box, where not only the disease was released, but all the other ills that we are blind to as churches. So maybe this is a good question to ask. Are we actually hearing the gospel as we should hear it as God's people?
Thank
So
you.
thank you so much for Andrew. It's been a very long time. We have been friends for a very long time. And good to see you.
Indeed.
Yes. And Bill and Gracie, our old friends and co-founders, in fact, of ISACC. For those of you who don't know, they were with us in the very beginning, in the foundation of ISACC, and still with us. And I appreciate that very much. And it's good to see our friends, Eric Miller and so on. Maybe, Eric, we will have an interview with you also at some point. So thank you all, and thank you very much. Good morning to the Californians. Good afternoon to the UK people, and good evening to all our friends here in the Philippines. So salamat po sa inyong pagtangkilik sa amin. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes.